By 1532, Francisco Pizarro stood at the precipice of the most monumental, yet riskiest, undertaking of his life. Years of hardship, failed attempts, and near financial ruin lay behind him. Now, as legends of a golden empire finally took shape, he faced a dilemma that could break any man. His force, meager in numbers, seemed a mere drop in the ocean compared to the might attributed to the Incas. Doubts plagued the conquistador's soul. Should he press onward into unknown lands where every step could be his last? The pressure of circumstances was immense. The grumbling of soldiers yearning for riches or a return home, and the realization that a second chance like this might never arise. It was a moment of profound contemplation, with the fate of an entire continent hanging by a thread, awaiting a single decision. An air of impending collision hung heavy, and a grand, irreversible step was inevitable. It was at this critical juncture that Pizarro revealed himself not merely as an adventurer, but as a strategist capable of the boldest moves. Surrounded by the murmurs of his own soldiers, keenly aware of his minuscule forces against the might of the Inca Empire, he made a decision that seemed insane. Not to wait, not to doubt, but to immediately push deeper into the unexplored territories. His initial plan, aimed at the legendary capital of Cusco, was suddenly altered. Rumors reached Pizarro that Atahualpa, one of the two brothers vying for the Inca throne, was in Cajamarca. This news became a catalyst. Cajamarca, not Cusco, was now destined to be the arena of the decisive battle. This move was dictated not only by audacity, but also by cold calculation, a desire to seize the initiative and decapitate the empire while it was still reeling from civil war. The road ahead, however, promised to be a test of endurance for every Spaniard. The path to Cajamarca, the anticipated arena of the decisive clash, proved to be a true trial of resilience. They faced not only the exhausting coastal heat, replaced by chilling high-altitude cold, but also the unseen threats of the wild Andes. Trails ended abruptly over precipices, and mountain passes seemed insurmountable. Among the conquistadors, accustomed to swift raids rather than such protracted suffering, murmurs began to rise. Doubts, previously suppressed, now resurfaced, whispering about the madness of this enterprise. But Pizarro, an old soldier who knew the value of discipline and faith, did not waver. He addressed his men not as a commander, but as a comrade in arms. He reminded them of glory, of gold, of God, and that there was no turning back. He urged them to make one last effort, to show unwavering loyalty, to grasp that this was their sole, unparalleled chance for greatness. It seemed that only a madman could lead such a paltry force into the unknown, toward the heart of a mighty empire. Many of his men, looking back at the traversed path, whispered of recklessness. How could they advance with only 150 infantrymen and a few dozen cavalrymen against a multi-thousand disciplined army led by a victorious chief? This situation was absurd, beyond any rational calculation. But it was precisely here that Francisco Pizarro's true essence emerged. His conviction in his own righteousness and impending triumph was almost mystical. He saw not the overwhelming numerical superiority of the enemy, but merely an obstacle that his will and audacity were capable of breaking. He believed that fate itself was leading them to untold riches and greatness. And so, finally, through the mountain passes, they saw the objective of their expedition. After an arduous trek through the impassable Andes, when every step seemed like the ultimate test, Pizarro's tiny force finally reached Cajamarca. What met their gaze should have broken any spirit. The valley stretched out, filled with thousands, tens of thousands of Inca warriors, whose tents, like mushrooms after rain, covered every hill. This was not just an army. It was a living embodiment of the power, wealth, and discipline of an empire spanning thousands of miles. Gold and silver gleamed on the attire of the nobility. Exotic bird feathers adorned helmets, and the disciplined ranks of warriors, armed with bronze axes and slings, seemed endless. The Spaniards, a mere handful, must have felt like grains of sand before this tide. Fear and doubt gripped many, but not Francisco Pizarro. In this terrifying grandeur, in this display of indomitable force, he saw not a threat, but an opportunity. His mind, sharp as a blade, was already calculating how to turn this power against itself. In Cajamarca, facing the countless Inca army, doubt and fear could have paralyzed anyone. But not Pizarro. He realized that an open battle with such forces was a sure path to annihilation. And then, in this critical situation, a truly desperate, almost insane plan, capable of changing the course of history, matured. Instead of a frontal assault on tens of thousands of warriors, Pizarro conceived the unthinkable: to capture the supreme Inca Atahualpa right in the heart of his own camp, surrounded by his own soldiers. This was not just a tactical move, but a daring gamble, banking on the shock and paralysis of will that would seize the empire, deprived of its divine ruler. The Spaniards were to hide, awaiting the perfect moment for a lightning strike. The day arrived that was destined to forever alter the fate of the empire. Atahualpa, unaware of the trap, moved toward Cajamarca. His appearance was a dazzling spectacle. Thousands of warriors carrying the supreme Inca on a golden palanquin adorned with exotic bird feathers and precious stones. Atahualpa himself, clad in the finest fabrics and bedecked in gold, shone with majesty and power. His gaze was filled with calm confidence. He approached the handful of strangers, seeing no threat in them, only curious barbarians to be greeted. His retinue, consisting of nobility and countless warriors, advanced, filling the square. The Spaniards, hidden in the surrounding buildings, watched this magnificence. Their hearts pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation. They saw not just a procession, but a moving treasure, the embodiment of power they intended to overthrow. Every horseman, every infantryman gripped their weapons, awaiting the moment that would forever rewrite history. The air of Cajamarca, just moments ago filled with the ceremonial hum of the Inca procession, suddenly condensed into an extreme silence. Thousands of indigenous people, mesmerized by the sight of their ruler, were unaware that behind the walls of the surrounding buildings, 150 desperate conquistadors lay frozen, holding their breath. Each Spaniard, gripping the hilt of his sword or readying his arquebus, waited for only one thing: the signal. And then, as Atahualpa, surrounded by gold and splendor, approached the very center of the square, the prearranged, fateful cry of Francisco Pizarro rang out. It was not just an order. It was the trigger for a chain reaction that instantly transformed a peaceful procession into bloody chaos. The suddenness of the attack, erupting from nowhere, became a shock, from which the Inca Empire would never recover. The silence hanging over Cajamarca's square shattered in an instant. At Pizarro's prearranged signal, a wave of Spaniards poured forth from the concealed city buildings. The deafening roar of arquebuses, the clang of steel, and the thunderous cry of "Santiago" pierced the air, transforming the ceremonial procession into bloody chaos. For the Incas, who had arrived unarmed and expecting peaceful dialogue, this was an unimaginable betrayal, erupting from nowhere. The deadly maelstrom that engulfed them was so sudden and brutal that they could not even comprehend what was happening. Their disciplined ranks instantly scattered in panic. Those who moments ago had gazed reverently upon their ruler now stumbled in terror, trying to escape the unknown threat. Fear and confusion paralyzed their will to resist. How could a handful of foreigners sow such terror among a multi-thousand crowd that had known no defeat? The ambush at Cajamarca was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was an execution. Spanish arquebuses, though slow to reload, tore through the dense ranks of the Inca procession. Their thunderous roar, amplified by the enclosed square, instilled primal terror in hearts, unfamiliar with such destructive power. Steel blades, wielded by experienced conquistadors, mowed down defenseless Incas, who possessed neither armor nor comparable weapons. Cavalry, unexpectedly bursting from cover, trampled and cut down desperately fleeing people, turning the square into a bloody slaughterhouse. This was not a clash of equals, but a methodical annihilation. Thousands of Incas, who had come to greet their ruler, fell victim to this sudden and merciless aggression. Their numerical superiority proved meaningless in the face of European military technology. In this chaotic carnage, at its very epicenter, something occurred that would forever change the fate of the empire. Chaos erupted across Cajamarca's square. As arquebuses spat fire and cavalry plunged into the crowd, Atahualpa remained the primary target. His opulent litter, a symbol of unshakable authority, became the epicenter of the bloody slaughter. Thousands of Incas, unarmed and stunned, scattered in panic, but not his bearers. These loyal warriors, understanding the sacredness of their duty, formed a living shield around their ruler. They clung to the litter even as they were cut down by swords, their bodies falling only to be immediately replaced by new ones. It was an act of incredible self-sacrifice, a demonstration of absolute loyalty to their Inca. Francisco Pizarro himself, trusting no one with such a crucial task, personally cut his way through this living wall. It was his hand, chronicles claim, that seized Atahualpa by his clothing and pulled him from the litter as the last defenders fell. Thus, in a single moment, the supreme Inca, a god to his people, became a prisoner. And this event had consequences that echoed throughout Tawantinsuyu. What transpired in Cajamarca's square became one of the most astonishing episodes in the history of conquests. In a matter of hours, an army numbering tens of thousands was routed, and its ruler, the supreme Inca Atahualpa, found himself a prisoner of a handful of foreigners. The outcome was not merely a victory, it was complete paralysis. The Tawantinsuyu Empire, stretching for thousands of kilometers, was decapitated with a single blow. Its complex hierarchy, its might, its millennia-old traditions, all crumbled when the last Sapa Inca was seized. The irony of fate was that Atahualpa, who had triumphed in a bloody civil war and had just consolidated his power, came of his own free will, unarmed, to meet his future captors. This day marked not just a defeat, but the beginning of the end for an entire civilization. He had yet to grasp the full depth of his tragedy and continued to believe that gold could buy him. Freedom. The capture of the supreme Inca was a shock for Tawantinsuyu, but for Atahualpa himself, it marked the beginning of a tragic delusion. In captivity, stripped of his accustomed power and surrounded by strangers, he could not fathom the true motives of these bearded newcomers. His world was one of gold and silver, symbols of divine origin and absolute power. He saw how greedily the Spaniards examined his ornaments, how their eyes lit up at the sight of precious objects. And he, the ruler of an empire whose treasures seemed inexhaustible, decided that the price of his freedom was merely a matter of the ransom's size. In his mind it was a deal, albeit a humiliating one, but understandable: gold for life. He offered Pizarro an unheard of, truly legendary treasure that was meant to surpass all their wildest dreams. What exactly he offered, and the price for such a promise, became a subject of unparalleled amazement and greed. Atahualpa, captured but still retaining the aura of the divine Sapa Inca, made an offer capable of astounding even the most avaricious conquistadors. He promised a ransom of such staggering proportions that to the Europeans it seemed an impossible fantasy. The Inca swore to fill the very room where he was held, approximately 22 feet long and 17 feet wide, with pure gold up to the level of his outstretched hand, standing on tiptoe. And as if that were not enough, he pledged to double that volume in silver. This was not merely a promise. It was an act of demonstrating power, intended to buy his freedom and show the Spaniards the true, unimaginable wealth of Tawantinsuyu. The conquistadors, stunned by the scale, immediately agreed, anticipating untold riches. They could not yet comprehend the absolute devotion and incredible efficiency with which the empire would set about fulfilling this unthinkable condition. The Incas, true to their sacred bond with the Sapa Inca, began an astonishing mobilization. Throughout the vast Tawantinsuyu, from the highest Andean peaks to the humid coastal plains, a decree was spread: bring gold and silver for their captive god. And they did. Caravans of hundreds, even thousands of llamas, laden with intricate gold ornaments, ritual silver vessels, and raw precious metals, slowly trekked toward Cajamarca. This was not just a transaction. It was an act of profound devotion, a testament to the absolute, almost mystical authority that Atahualpa still wielded, even in captivity. The very fabric of their society, built on unwavering loyalty to the divine Inca, ensured that every request, every command was met with meticulous obedience, even if it meant the despoliation of their most sacred temples. The Spaniards watched, disbelieving their eyes, as the promised treasure steadily accumulated, a gleaming testament to the boundless faith and wealth of a civilization. Countless treasures flowed into Cajamarca, filling the room with gold up to the marked line. The Incas fulfilled their part of the bargain, demonstrating unquestioning loyalty to their Sapa Inca. But for Pizarro and his men, gold was merely a means, not an end. Atahualpa's freedom was never part of their plan. Despite the complete fulfillment of the ransom terms, the conquistadors, driven by paranoid fear of a possible uprising and a thirst for absolute power, treacherously broke the agreement. Atahualpa was accused of idolatry, polygamy, and most importantly, inciting rebellion against the Spaniards. The trial was a farce, The verdict: death. Even Charles V later condemned this execution, calling it the greatest act of injustice. This event became a turning point, forever staining the conqueror's reputation and foreshadowing the inevitable fall of the empire. Atahualpa's execution, treacherous and cruel, marked an irreversible turning point in the history of Tawantinsuyu. With the fall of the supreme Inca, the very core of the empire seemed to collapse. However, for Francisco Pizarro, this was not the end, but merely the prelude to the culmination. The death of the captive ruler removed the last formal obstacle on the path to complete subjugation of the lands, opening the way for the Spaniards to the sacred capital, Cusco. Without losing a moment after the execution, the conquistadors, intoxicated by the anticipation of new riches and boundless power, moved south. Their goal was the heart of Inca civilization, a city whose walls, according to legends, were paved with gold and whose temples held treasures beyond all conceivable limits. This march, seemingly destined to be a triumphal procession, saw the Incas, though decapitated, far from completely broken. The shock of their Sapa Inca's death turned into rage and despair, giving rise to a resistance that the Spaniards still had to overcome. The path to the cherished city promised to be not only long, but also deadly. The path to the sacred Inca capital, Cusco, was no easy stroll for Pizarro and his men. Despite the death of the Sapa Inca resistance did not wane. It flared up with renewed vigor. For several weeks, the Spaniards had to fight their way through mountain passes and narrow gorges, where ambushes awaited them. The Incas, led by their commanders such as Quizquiz and Rumiñahui, fought desperately for every inch of land. 4 major battles, at Vilcashuaman, Vilcacochas, Jauja, and Vitas, became bloody milestones on this journey. In each of them, the Incas displayed unprecedented bravery. Their numerical superiority was overwhelming, but they faced the insurmountable advantage of Spanish weaponry and tactics. Steel swords, arquebuses, and the previously unseen animals that carried the horsemen sowed terror and panic in their ranks, determining the outcome of these unequal clashes. It was a confrontation of two worlds, where one possessed technological superiority, and the other only boundless courage and devotion to their land. Spanish horses, unseen in the Andes, were not merely a means of transport or attack. To the Incas, they became the embodiment of mythical, death-dealing creatures. These centaurs instilled terror, paralyzing the will to resist. The mere sight of a galloping horseman, encased in steel, could send hundreds of warriors fleeing, unable to comprehend the nature of these formidable beings. This was not an equal fight, but a clash where technological superiority and psychological pressure created a monstrous disparity in casualties. While the Spaniards lost only a few, Inca armies bled by the thousands, their ranks dwindling under the onslaught of unseen weapons and mystical fear. This shock, which shattered the foundations of Decisive, their world, was key to Pizarro's relentless advance toward Cusco. However, even the capture of the sacred capital did not signify the complete subjugation of a proud people. And so, finally, sacred Cusco, the heart of Tawantinsuyu, fell. On November 15, 1533, the Spaniards entered the city that the Incas considered the center of the world, the navel of the universe. This event, it seemed, should have been the triumphant conclusion of Pizarro's daring expedition, a symbol of ultimate conquest. Gold and treasures, exceeding all conceivable riches, flowed into the hands of the conquistadors, confirming their wildest dreams. However, paradoxically, the physical capture of the capital did not mean the subjugation of the empire's spirit. The taking of Cusco was merely the end of the first act, not the entire play. The empire, deprived of its gods and ruler, was fractured, but not broken. Resistance continued in the mountains and valleys, where no Spaniard had yet trod. Now, Pizarro had not only to hold what he had seized, but also to govern this vast, still defiant territory, which required entirely different qualities than those that had led him to victory. This was the beginning of a new, complex chapter, where the conqueror had to become a ruler. The capture of Cusco marked the apotheosis of a daring campaign, but for Francisco Pizarro, it was merely the prologue to a far more complex mission. From then on, his role shifted. From a ruthless conqueror, he had to transform into an administrator, capable not only of holding what he had seized, but also of lending an appearance of legitimacy to the new order. The Tawantinsuyu Empire, though headless, remained vast and potentially rebellious. Pizarro understood that direct foreign rule without reliance on local structures was doomed. Therefore, a strategic decision was made to crown a new Sapa Inca, a puppet who would serve as a facade for Spanish domination. The choice fell to the young Manco Inca, Atahualpa's brother, who seemed pliable to the Spaniards. His enthronement, though under the complete control of the conquistadors, was meant to create an illusion of continuity, pacify the population, and facilitate the further exploitation of the untold riches that Cusco and the entire empire now offered to their new masters. These treasures, accumulated over centuries, awaited their distribution. With the fall of Cusco and the ostensible legitimization of power through a puppet Inca, Pizarro faced a new, equally complex task: the division of the untold riches accumulated over centuries in the heart of the empire. Gold and silver, adorning temples and palaces, were now subjected to ruthless confiscation and melting. Every conquistador, from cavalryman to infantryman, received his share, proportionate to rank and contribution to the conquest, which inevitably bred envy and strife among yesterday's comrades. But true wealth lay not only in metals, lands, and most importantly, the indigenous people were now regarded as property, distributed under the encomienda system, virtual slavery disguised as an obligation to convert to Christianity. Pizarro, far-sighted and pragmatic, understood that mere plunder would not keep the Spaniards in this foreign, hostile land. He began to lay the foundations for a permanent presence, striving to transform the Inca territory into a stable colony. This required not only the distribution of current spoils, but also the creation of an administrative structure. With the fall of Cusco, Pizarro not only completed the conquest, but also took on the burden of governance. His ambitions extended beyond plunder. He sought to lay the foundation for a new colonial administration. In 1535, recognizing the strategic importance of a coastal location for communication with the mother country, Pizarro founded Ciudad de los Reyes, the City of Kings, now Lima. This city, like other Spanish settlements arising from the ruins of Inca civilization, was intended to be a stronghold of the new order. The conquistador, once the leader of a daring expedition, now attempted to become an administrator, implementing Spanish laws, distributing lands and indigenous people under the encomienda system. He sought to bring order to chaos. But beneath the veneer of this order, a great tragedy unfolded. European diseases, unbearable labor in mines and plantations, and the destruction of their traditional way of life, all befell the indigenous population. Spanish civilization asserted itself, but at the cost of the unimaginable extinction of those who had been there originally. However, the order established by the Spanish turned into a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions for Tawantinsuyu. The encomienda system, essentially legalized slavery, destroyed the centuries-old, well-oiled economic model based on communal labor and reciprocity. The gold and silver that poured into Spain were washed in the blood of millions of Incas, who perished from unfamiliar European diseases, unbearable labor in mines, and cruel treatment. A unique civilization, which had created magnificent roads, sophisticated agricultural terraces, and a complex social structure without writing, was ruthlessly dismantled. Its knowledge, art, and traditions, everything that made it unique, were either destroyed or forgotten under the yoke of a foreign world. This was not merely a conquest, but a tragic collapse of an entire universe, forever changing the landscape of the continent. But even under this unbearable pressure, the spirit of resistance was not entirely broken. However, the illusion of peace and control created by Pizarro was fragile. The young Sapa Inca Manco, installed on the throne as a puppet, quickly realized the true state of affairs. Instead of reverence, he faced unprecedented humiliations and audacious demands. The Spaniards, blinded by their greed for gold and power, stopped at nothing, even kidnapping his wife and subjecting him to physical abuse. Their arrogance knew no bounds. But in the soul of the humiliated ruler, the fire of resistance did not die out. He methodically, in deep secrecy, began to weave a complex web of conspiracy, using his nominal position to gather loyal warriors and plan his revenge. The conquistadors, confident in their invincibility, had no idea that their puppet was about to transform into a formidable adversary, preparing a blow of unprecedented force. The humiliation Manco, the puppet ruler installed by the Spaniards, suffered only served as a catalyst. In 1536, he cast off his mask of subservience, raising the banner of the largest rebellion in the history of the conquest. Tens of thousands of Incas, consumed by a thirst for revenge and a desire to regain sovereignty, descended upon the Spanish garrisons. The main assault targeted Cusco, the former capital, which had been transformed into a fortress. The city was besieged by Manco's immense army, reaching 200,000 warriors. The Spaniards, their indigenous allies, and slaves, found themselves trapped, enduring unthinkable hardships. Months of fierce fighting and constant assaults exhausted both sides. The conquistadors' losses were colossal. At times it seemed their fate was sealed. This was a battle for the soul of the empire, where the Incas demonstrated incredible resilience and a willingness to die for freedom. But despite their desperate resistance, their ancient methods of warfare could not always counter European weapons and tactics. Months of the siege of Cusco had exhausted the Spaniards. It seemed the Inca Empire, even decapitated, was capable of shaking off the foreigners. At a critical moment, long-awaited reinforcements arrived to aid the besieged. Diego de Almagro, returning from a failed Chilean expedition, brought fresh forces, though few in number, but decisive. Their arrival broke Manco Inca's will to continue the hopeless siege. His vast army, unable to take the city, began to disperse. Manco did not surrender. He made a strategic decision, retreating into the inaccessible Amazonian jungles, to Vilcabamba, the last refuge where he founded a neo-Inca state. From there, he waged guerrilla warfare for decades, becoming a symbol of unyielding resistance. His fate proved tragically ironic. He was killed in 1544 by Spanish deserters, whom he himself had granted refuge. With his death, organized Inca resistance effectively ceased. But while one threat faded, another, far more personal and deadly, loomed over Pizarro. It was an irony of fate, or perhaps an inevitable outcome for an era of such grand conquests, that Francisco Pizarro's greatest danger originated not from external threats, but from within his own circle, among those who had shared his hardships and triumphs. No sooner had the last salvos of Manco Inca's rebellion faded than the shadow of Diego de Almagro emerged on the horizon. Once Pizarro's loyal comrade, Almagro had now become his irreconcilable rival. Their long-standing disagreements, smoldering beneath the ashes of their joint ventures, flared up with renewed intensity, transforming into an open struggle for power and territory. The city of Cusco, the heart of the Inca Empire, became the bone of contention, each conquistador viewing it as his rightful prize. This internal strife, far more brutal and devoid of illusions than their war against the indigenous people, threatened to tear the Spanish colony apart from within. The conquerors who had subdued an entire empire were now poised to destroy each other in a fight over its remnants. Once the dust settled, Francisco Pizarro, the audacious adventurer, now sat atop his newly acquired empire. In Ciudad de los Reyes, the city he founded and named Lima, his power was absolute, and his wealth immeasurable. After quelling Manco Inca's rebellion and brutally eliminating Diego de Almagro, it seemed nothing could threaten his position. The conquistadors' days unfolded in a grand routine: state affairs, managing vast territories, and overseeing the streams of gold pouring in from mines and encomiendas. He lived like a true ruler, surrounded by luxuries unimaginable for a simple swineherd from Extremadura. His house overflowed with Inca treasures, his table with exquisite delicacies, and his personal habits reflected his newfound power. He was a master whose decisions went unchallenged. He reveled in the fruits of his ruthless victories, believing that the era of turmoil had passed. Yet, even as the sun illuminated his gilded chambers, discontent and the fates of those who felt betrayed lurked in the shadows. After the elimination of Diego de Almagro the Elder, it seemed Francisco Pizarro had reached the pinnacle of his power, asserting absolute control over Peru. But victory is rarely final. Beneath the facade of his triumph lay deep resentment. Almagro's supporters, stripped of their lands and indigenous laborers, found themselves impoverished, their once glorious services forgotten and promises broken. They were outcasts, veterans who had shed blood for the crown, now living a miserable existence in the shadow of Pizarro's grandeur. Their indignation grew, fueled by a sense of their own helplessness. Their hope rested on the young Diego de Almagro the Younger, son of the executed conquistador. In him, they saw not only a legitimate heir, but also a banner for their vengeance. Desperation and a sense of injustice united these men into a formidable force. Secretly, in Lima's darkest corners, they hatched a plan to end Pizarro's dominion and avenge their leader's death. The shadow of retribution already loomed over the city, but the Marquis himself seemed oblivious to the approaching danger. Pizarro, having reached the zenith of his power, seemed to have forgotten the precariousness of his position. Warnings about the conspiracy of Almagro's supporters, now known as the Men of Chile, were dismissed by him with arrogant nonchalance, considering them merely a handful of desperate individuals. Perhaps years of easy victories had dulled his instinct for self-preservation. His last day, June 26, 1541, began as an ordinary Sunday. But during his meal, as the street noise escalated into the clash of swords and cries of "Death to the tyrant," reality crashed down upon him. Around 20 conspirators stormed his house. At 63. Despite his age, Pizarro did not flinch. He seized his sword and defended himself fiercely, killing 2. But the forces were unequal. One of the assassins struck him in the throat. The great conquistador collapsed, drawing a cross with his own blood on the floor. Thus, ignominiously, in a pool of his own blood, ended the life of the man who had overthrown an entire empire. On June 26, 1541, in the very heart of Lima, the city he founded, Francisco Pizarro, the great conquistador, fell at the hands of conspirators. His death was neither peaceful nor heroic, but brutal and chaotic, much like the greater part of his life. It was a bloody end, echoing the ruthlessness with which he himself had descended upon the Inca Empire. The cycle of violence he had initiated in Cajamarca, when he treacherously executed Atahualpa, and which continued with the elimination of Almagro, now concluded. The sword with which he had conquered turned against him. In a sense, his violent demise was not merely an act of revenge, but a symbolic retribution, the final chord in the symphony of destruction he had orchestrated. His death marked not only the end of one life, but the close of an entire era, leaving deep, indelible scars on the face of the continent. Despite his bloody end, Francisco Pizarro left an indelible mark on the map of the new continent. Ciudad de los Reyes, which he founded and is now Lima, became the magnificent capital of the viceroyalty of Peru. In its cathedral, in the late 19th century, the conquistador's remains were found and reinterred. On his skull, a symbol of that ruthless era, a concise inscription was carved, "Here lies Pizarro." He was the embodiment of his era, a man of boundless audacity and ruthless determination. His actions forever reshaped the geography and destinies of millions, destroying one great civilization and initiating another. Pizarro's legacy, like that of the entire conquest, continues to spark fierce debate, shaping the complex identity of a continent whose history is inextricably linked to this clash